Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Five Conversations Framework webinar. I'm presenting this webinar from Cairns, and those of you from overseas, that's in northern part of Australia. It's a beautiful time of the year in the winter here, and a great place for a holiday. But anyway, enough of the commercial about where I'm doing this from. Many of you have, looking at the list, there are people from all over the world. There are people from large businesses, small businesses. There are people who are in small to medium-sized enterprises. We've got consultants here. We've got people from the public sector, the private sector. We've got a wide diversity of people, and I think essentially that's testament to the fact that this really is about people. So I'll just leave you with two thoughts before we get into the presentation. One of those thoughts is that I believe that organisations are conversations. What I mean by that is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, or even tens of thousands of conversations going on every day in every organisation. So the question really then is, are these conversations productive? Are they helpful? And I think in a lot of cases they're not. That's the first thought I'd leave you with. And I think the second thought I'd leave you with is this, that I'm attempting to move the discussion from performance appraisal to performance conversations or developmental conversations. And I think there's fundamentally a big difference. And this is not about tinkering at the edges with the performance review. This is about fundamentally saying that it's not working. My research demonstrates that. I'll show you some of that in a moment. It's not working, so what should we be doing? And that's essentially where we've got to. So welcome. If you've got questions, please just type them into the question box there on the right-hand side. I'll attempt to answer as many of those as I can at the end of this broadcast. If I fail to answer those, I will follow up and send you an email and answer those. So please do that. I think we should just leave that to the end, but at any stage during the broadcast, just type your question in there and I'll deal with it at the end of the broadcast. Okay, so as Graham Norton says, let's get into it. All right, so there's probably there's three things that I'd like to achieve out of today's session. As I get my screen working. Okay, the first, I guess there's three objectives that I'd like to achieve. I think the first thing I'd like to achieve in this broadcast is to familiarise yourself with the process of the Five Conversations Framework. I guess that's why you're here, fundamentally, to find out what it's all about. And I think many of you probably have got a very good understanding of it. Some of you probably it's completely new to you, and others might have some idea and want to know more. So certainly I hope by the end of this presentation I can give you that information. So obviously I want to help you familiarise yourself with the five conversations themselves. So there's a process involved and there's also five conversations. So I want to go through both of those during this broadcast. And I guess probably talk a little bit around why performance reviews are outdated and ineffective. Now, I suspect many of you are using performance reviews still. I don't know what feedback you're getting, but generally speaking, the feedback that I get is not necessarily terribly encouraging. I haven't come across any research anywhere in the world that actually empirically demonstrates that performance reviews actually enhance performance. And if that's the case, then I guess the question is, why do we continue with it? So let's have a look at some of the research. I actually spoke to 1,400 HR managers in this part of the world, in Asia, New Zealand, Australia. I simply asked them a question: what are your concerns about the current review system that you have, if you have any? So I was just really trying to collect information about what people's concerns were about the traditional performance appraisal. So I'd like to go through some of those things with you. I think, and these aren't necessarily in any order, but basically 8 themes came up clearly. And one of the themes was that they were costly. that they, because obviously if you're doing a review once a year, and let's say that it takes an hour, you've got an hour perhaps of maybe half an hour preparation, both for the employee and the manager doing the appraisal, not to mention the costs of not doing your core job while you're downing tools to do this review. It actually becomes an extremely costly exercise. That in itself is not a problem. The problem is really whether or not we're getting value for money. And a lot of HR managers told me that they didn't feel that they were getting value for money, and that's precisely the reason why they felt that that it was a costly exercise. A lot of HR managers told me that after the review process, their work really started, and that is in terms of mediating and dealing with conflict in the workplace, or two people didn't get on, or there were accusations of bullying or whatever. I don't necessarily think this is purely because of the performance appraisal. I think it's probably because these two people haven't been talking during the year, and the manager may well have blindsided somebody by giving them some feedback, which he or she should have done maybe 3 or 4 months ago. I've heard the comment that the appraisals are often a monologue rather than a dialogue, and that's pretty true, isn't it? The manager sits there often behind the large mahogany desk, basically giving this feedback, and the person at the receiving end, the team member, sits there passively taking it all in. Perhaps they get a word in every now and again. They're not really dialogue. And one of the reasons for that is because there's an appraisal element to it, and that means that clearly people are on edge about that whole process. I've also heard that the formality, and I guess these two go together, the formality of the appraisal stifles discussion. And I think that's very true, in the sense that it's usually done in the manager's office at the time that it's convenient for the manager, and it's probably not the most conducive environment for having a realistic performance conversation, and the process itself does stifle discussion. Another big theme coming up from my research, and this won't surprise anyone, is that they're done too infrequently. We started off doing them once a year. Organisations have kind of moved to twice a year. Some of them are doing them quarterly now. But still in all, they're infrequent in the sense that by the time we sit down and have this big event, whatever has happened or occurred that might be useful in terms of giving feedback has passed. And the exercise becomes a bureaucratic nightmare of filling out forms, and usually these forms over the last couple of years have been simplified, but the truth of the matter is there's still forms to fill out. It's not unusual for a manager not to make eye contact with their particular team member during these appraisal interviews because they're too busy filling out the paperwork. And what happens at the end of the particular performance review is that the HR manager chases people to get their forms in, and so therefore the perception is that it's a box ticking exercise rather than a genuine performance conversation. Appraisals are rarely followed up because they're quite stressful. What happens is that they get filed away, either electronically or in a filing cabinet somewhere. Very rarely are they looked at again until the next appraisal comes around, and then the manager will have a quick cursory look through it perhaps, and then start the process again. So there's nothing that really occurs between appraisals, and obviously that means that they're talk fests, that nothing has really changed unless they're followed up. And the eighth theme that I picked up from my research is that they're generally pretty stressful. Not only do employees find them stressful because they're on the receiving end of it, but managers themselves find it stressful in the sense that they find it, it's a daunting prospect to sit down and give people ratings and grade them and go through a process when they haven't really had any sort of dialogue with that person for the duration of the year. So they're the 8 themes. I don't think anyone in this broadcast would say, well, that surprises me. Perhaps what it does is, and like a lot of these sorts of things, it confirms what we already know. But clearly, I guess I'm mounting a case to say that there are a lot of things that are wrong with the current system that we have. So I pose the question, why do we do it? Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's out there in terms of the review process and just give people a little bit of perspective about that. So if we take a continuum, at one end of the continuum we have the traditional approach, and in the middle we have the kind of discussion, performance conversation approach that I'm advocating. And at the right-hand side now, there are a few companies now experimenting with peer group approach, where people in an office, for example, might be rating each other and giving feedback on each other. Early days on how that's going, but it's certainly out there as an option. So if you look at the traditional approach, it's based on the military concept where the superior would sit down with the subordinate once a year and go through the ritual of giving them feedback on how they're performing. In the discussion domain, which is essentially where the 5 conversations fits in, it's more of a relationship. So in other words, the success of that will very much depend on the quality of the working relationship between the manager and the employee. And I'd like to think the framework that I'm advocating actually does a lot to improve the relationship. And then, of course, the third one, the more modern approach, is the teamwork approach, where the team basically give feedback on might be in the form of a 360-degree diagnostic, for example. So the traditional approach is essentially based on power. I mean, the superior clearly has power over the subordinate. So basically what the superior says goes. And in the discussion approach, it's more of an agreement, which is more of a dialogue rather than a monologue. So it's about agreement. Even to agree to disagree can be an agreement. And then we have the peer group approach, where there is multiple sources of feedback, where there can be a compelling case perhaps that someone has to improve their listening skills, or maybe they're not easy to deal with, and overwhelmingly 95% of people say that. So it becomes quite compelling because of the number of inputs into that feedback. So the traditional approach is based on management judgment only, and I still believe most organisations are muddling their way through the traditional approach. They're tinkering at the edges, trying to make it more in the middle in the discussion by giving managers a lot of coaching and training on how to have a conversation and so forth. But I think essentially it's still pretty much in the traditional domain. The discussion approach is based on mutual agreement, and I think I've covered that. And the peer group approach is based on a peer group judgment. So essentially that's what's out there in the marketplace, and there are variations and derivatives of those styles and approaches. The 5 conversations is very much in the middle in terms of the discussion approach. So it's actually about moving organisations from the traditional to the discussion approach. Okay, moving right along. Pardon me here, my screen is frozen. Okay, so if I just talk about the process, so what I'd like to do now is just run through the process of how the 5 conversations framework works, and then what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of an overview about what the 5 conversations are. The first step in the process is that we populate a template. Basically, that's everybody in the organisation. What information we're after is their email address, their name, and essentially who they report to. So what that data does is give us the opportunity to populate the online system that we have in place. The next step is to assess the current state. Now, what we actually, and I'll show you some of this in a moment, with a client that I'm working with right now, but what we actually do is try and get a benchmark of where the organisation is at right now. And we do that because what we want to do is to be able to demonstrate clearly that there's been some improvement as a result of the 5 conversations. I mean, we don't do this with a traditional review. We just kind of muddle through it each year and just hope it works, move on to the next thing. So we assess the current state, and that gives us a benchmark to work from. The next step is that anybody that's actually conducting any of these conversations receives some, what we call here, management training, which is essentially a couple of hours. And that training is why we're doing this, how these conversations work, what you can get out of it, what some of the benchmarking material said from step 2, and essentially it gets people ready to go. I find from experience there's 2 reasons why this will not work. One is that there isn't management training, and secondly, because that there isn't a system to be able to record the data that comes out of the 5 conversations. Because what you'll find is if you don't do those things, people might be enthusiastic about it, but what will happen is they'll just drop the ball, and busyness will get in the way, and the conversations won't occur. So you need a system in place to make that happen. As I said, there's an online support system, and I'm going to show you how that works shortly. So obviously during the management training, people are geared up and shown how to use that. Then there's one cycle of 5 conversations that occurs. That cycle will last for 5 months. So it's one 10 to 15 minute conversation once a month for 5 months. Sometimes those conversations go longer, but that's by mutual agreement, and sometimes they should go longer, quite frankly. But essentially it's designed to be short, sharp, meaningful and focused. The assumption I'm making here is that performance increases, and we've had one round of the 5 conversations. We go through a second round of the 5 conversations. The second round of the 5 conversations occurs, which are essentially exactly the same conversations we had previously. And then what happens is that we use the diagnostic tool that I'm going to show you in a minute to actually reassess the workplace. So what we can do is have a before and after snapshot about whether or not 2 rounds, essentially meaning 10 conversations across the whole workplace, has made a difference. So basically, if you're an HR person, and I think most of you are in this webinar, you have strong foundations on the assumption, of course, that you can see demonstrated performance increases. You have strong grounds to say, well, look, this is working because we've got the numbers and we can demonstrate that we're making progress. And that's always reassuring for anyone in HR where it's difficult to measure some of these things. Speaking of which, I won't go into great detail about how all these work, but essentially the report that comes out of the 5 conversations, you'll notice across the top there are the categories which are the same categories as the 5 conversations. So you've got your climate review, and you've got your strengths and talent, opportunities for growth, learning and development, and innovation and continuous improvement. Now all this is just a snapshot of an organisation and how they fared collectively in those 5 areas, which essentially are the areas we'll cover a bit more in detail. You'll also notice that the red circle is top management, the yellow circle is mid-management, and the blue circle is workforce. And so we've got a vertical stratification of the organisation, which I think often a lot of surveys don't do. They just simply, this department compared to that department compared with that team. You get all that anyway, but what this does is to show whether there is a vertical integration between the ideas. But essentially, what you're looking for here is one big white circle with a lot of pluses in it. That tells you that the organisation is faring well, that there's alignment between all 3 perspectives. So we'll have a look at this in a bit more detail. I won't go through a huge number of these, but this is a real live client that we're working with at the moment. And what you've got here is you notice up the top, of course, it's the category, which is opportunities for growth. And this came out, remember, the first benchmark. So this isn't after, but this is the first actual survey results. The statement there is, I am aware of each of my immediate team members' work-related deficiencies. Now that's the statement that any manager, in other words, anybody, or supervisor, anybody that would be running the conversations would actually answer, whereas the workforce perspective would answer, he or she is aware of each of his or her immediate team members' work-related deficiencies. So in other words, it's just tailored a little bit more for the actual workforce participant. Now what you've got here is you've got top management, in this case there are 3, agreeing 100%. Yes, I'm absolutely aware of the deficiencies of my team members. In this case, it would be middle management, as you can imagine. Middle management is saying, yep, absolutely aware, no problem, 100%, only 5 in that survey result. And what you've got at the workforce is where it's very interesting. You've got 45% of people saying, well, 15 out of 33, saying, yeah, I agree. But what's interesting is 46 are sitting on the fence and 9 are disagreeing. So in other words, what this result is actually saying is it's probably true that the manager and middle managers and all the supervisors probably do know what people's deficiencies are, but the workforce isn't as confident, and probably because, and I know this is the case in this example, because they haven't communicated that. So they haven't actually, explained to them that, yes, I believe that this is a deficiency and I'm willing to work with you to overcome that. So there's a result. You would be expecting that after 2 rounds of the 5 conversations, the workforce perspective would be considerably better, and I'm hoping that the top management and middle management perspective stays the same. Here's another one on the 5th conversation, or the 5th category, innovation and continuous improvement. And the statement is, my direct reports have made suggestions to me about ways to improve efficiencies and effectiveness in the organisation. So that's the statement that anyone in a leadership role would have answered, and of course it would have been reversed for the workforce. But top management is saying 100%. So they're saying that, yes, I've seen it. I've seen a lot of people come to me with suggestions. Then it drops off a bit, 60% with middle management, 1 out of 5 saying disagree, and then you've got workforce 52, 39 and 9. So again, this opens up a discussion about why this result is the way it is. This is part of the training that the managers and the supervisors go through. And of course, what we're looking for is, after 2 conversations on innovation and continuous improvement, you would expect that those results should increase or be better. And of course, that's what we're aiming to do. So we've got a benchmarking tool to do that. So let's move on. So that's the tool. Now, what I want to do now is just talk a little bit around, perhaps I'm making a controversial statement here. Maybe many of you are on board and would accept this, but here's a statement. The roles that people play in organisations are more important than the jobs they do. Now that sounds a little bit controversial, but the roles that people play, and I call these non-job roles, are becoming more and more important in terms of performance and productivity in workplaces. And what happens is our job descriptions don't capture those to the same extent that they capture the technical skills that people are required to do, or the key result areas. So essentially it sends a very big statement across the organisation that you can be a pain in the you-know-what, provided you do your job effectively. And in fact, people will actually justify that because they'll say that it's not on their job description. So what the 5 conversations essentially does is take a more holistic view of performance. Now what I mean by that is it doesn't just look at the technical aspects of what people do. It still does, but it also looks at the non-job roles that people play. Let me explain that a little bit more to you. So if you look at this slide, you'll notice that up the top, the work that people do can be broken up into 2 areas. Now, there's nothing mysterious on the left-hand side. These are job skills or job tasks, and these are the technical requirements for anybody to do their job effectively. So, that traditionally has made up 80, 90, even 100% of the average job description. Now, if you look over on the right-hand side, I've actually identified 4 non-job roles that I believe every one of you in this broadcast would find that a useful attribute of somebody in your organisation or the organisations you work with demonstrating. For example, a positive mental attitude and enthusiasm. Now, we don't expect people to be bouncing off the walls when they come to work, but we certainly don't expect them to be spoilers either. And I think much of our work is around, getting people to stop sort of sabotaging meetings and doing all sorts of destructive things in the workplace. I don't think it's unreasonable for people to come to work with a reasonably positive, solution-focused attitude. And I believe that's a non-job task that is absolutely vital in any line of work. And I'll back that up very shortly with some more research. We expect everybody to work in teams. We expect people to be team players. Now it's more important than ever before. We all know that because we're all working in flatter organisations. We're all doing more with less. We're all working in a dynamic environment, and consequently, we're expecting people to work with each other in a team environment. So I don't think it's unreasonable that another non-job task that we're expecting people to do or role is actually the team role. So we're expecting people to do those things, and why shouldn't we be talking about those things in terms of the broader context of performance? The third one, which is a career role, is essentially about people coming to work and continuing to grow and develop as an individual. And I think that I've heard so many people say to me, "Oh, look, I'm a bit old for that. I won't go to that course or that training program. I don't want to do that. Or I've been doing things this way for so long, I don't really want to do anything different." Well, of course, that's not helping that person. It's certainly not helping the organisation. So what the career role is essentially about is actually asking people, and that's why I call it career role, to develop themselves and their technical capacity on an ongoing basis so that they can be useful for the career and also for the organisation which they are engaged with. So I don't think that's an unreasonable ask. That's a non-job task or role that people are expected to play in the workplace. And finally, innovation and continuous improvement. Not only are we wanting people in the career role to develop themselves, we also want them to develop the organisation as well, to bring their ideas to work, to actually start to think about how things could be more efficient and effective. And we've all been waiting for 25 years since Peter Senge talked about the learning organisation. I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, but essentially there, I would say to you that there are 4 non-job roles that I think are applicable to any industry. And I think we don't spend enough time working on those because, let's face it, they're all going to affect performance, directly or indirectly. So therefore, they have to be part of the equation. And that's why I said before that I believe that the roles people play are just as, if not more important, than the technical role or job tasks that people do. Now, just to back up my point about that is if you look at this slide, I realise it's very busy, but I'm just going to try and make a point here, is that this was a survey that was done of 9,000 managers across 21 industries in 3 continents. So it was fairly comprehensive. And essentially, it was a simple question that was asked. And the simple question is, if there's one most valued job skill that you would want in your employees, what would it be? So what you've got here on this table is the list that was mentioned and the frequency which they were mentioned. So, you know, the one there, you'll notice across there it says enthusiasm, enthusiasm and a positive attitude. Yeah, well, there you go. So that's what managers are saying. They want people with enthusiasm and a positive attitude. That is the number one job skill according to this particular survey. Some of you might say, well, that's not really a job skill. It's certainly something that people want in employees, whether it's categorised as a job skill or not. So if you cast your eyes down that list, and I'm not going to run through them all because that's not the purpose of the presentation, you'll notice that all of those things fall on the right-hand side of the previous slide, which of course was about non-job tasks or non-job roles. All of them. You'll notice they're all mindsets, they're all attitudes, they're all roles that people can choose to play or not to play in the workplace. And so if that's what managers are saying that they want in their people, then I think our performance systems have to gear ourselves up for this. And I know some of you in your job descriptions have said, oh, well, hang on, we have moved towards role. We've included some of this material in our roles. I would say that it's probably not as comprehensive as it would be with the task or the technical side. It needs to be at least as comprehensive. And people will often say to me, yeah, but you can't measure these things. Well, actually you can, and you do it via 360 feedback, and you do that, you know, you saw the continuum before. Over on the right-hand side, you can use peer group input to evaluate whether people are actually demonstrating these non-job roles. And you can actually talk to them and have a conversation about that. I think that's highly recommended. All right, moving right along, here's the 5 conversations framework, and you'll notice that in the first column is the month. So the first important point I'd make here is that I'm arguing that every manager, every supervisor, every coordinator, anybody in a leadership role should be having one conversation with each of their direct reports once a month for 5 months. Now, bear in mind, these are 10 to 15-minute conversations. They're not supposed to be 1 hour. They are not about another form of review. They are 10 to 15-minute conversations. Can you imagine what your organisation would look like if you could say at the end of 12 months that every single manager and supervisor in this organisation has engaged in 10 to 15-minute conversations that are developmental with each of the people reporting to them? I think you would have to agree that that would make a difference, but you need a system, obviously, to do that. The topics in the middle I've sort of covered before, and, you know, you might say, well, why have you got it in that order? I think you could probably see some logic in that order. The climate review, and I'll cover that in a minute, is really essentially about how people are going in terms of morale and their job satisfaction. It's a fairly easy conversation to get into, and then you move straight to people's strengths, a la the positive psychology movement that's been around for 25 years. We don't do enough of this, and there's a lot of reasons for this, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But essentially what we should be doing is looking at what people are good at. What are their innate talents, and how can we build on those now and in the future? You'll get much better return on investment by doing it that way. So that creates an upwards spiral. So the third conversation is looking at what people need to work on. We all have things we've got to work on, and clearly it has to be discussed at some point. So we discuss opportunities for growth in the third conversation. The fourth conversation, as you can imagine, falling out of the second and the third conversation will be a whole lot of learning opportunities, undoubtedly. So the learning and development conversation really does tap into your learning and, you know, what do people need to learn? And I don't mean sending people off to programs. It might just be coaching someone how to do something or showing somebody something. So learning, it's very pervasive. That's why I call it a learning and development conversation, not a training conversation. And month 5 is an innovation and continuous improvement conversation, which is essentially asking every employee to come to a conversation to talk about what they perceive to be things that could be improved in the organisation or something completely new, which of course is innovation. So that's the cycle, and I'm pretty excited about that last conversation. Can you imagine, getting back to that, that in your organisation in August, it's having an innovation and continuous improvement conversation. Everybody's involved. Everybody's coming to those conversations prepared. You can imagine that that will generate a lot of excitement, a lot of ideas, a lot of innovation. Now, not all of those ideas will be practical, but I dare say, law of averages, some of them will, and that's the power of this. So the step 5 is really about working on the organisation. So that's the framework, guys, and what I'll do now is just talk a little bit about each of the conversations and some of the things that are in there that might be useful. The climate review conversation is essentially starts with the question, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? That's the first question that the manager asks, or the supervisor asks the employee. Now, bear in mind, they're not blindsided, because the employee is going to come to that conversation already having thought about the answer to that question. So that creates a conversation rather than appraisal. And the employee might say, well, I would rate it a 6. And then the manager says, can you explain why? Why 6? And then, of course, that person will explain that. And then they'll go on to morale, and they'll go on to communication, asking the same, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate morale? How would you rate communication? Now, essentially what you're doing in conversation 1 is creating an engagement survey right across the organisation, but you're doing it in the context of the 5 conversations framework. So you don't have to go out and spend tens or even hundreds or even millions of dollars on engagement surveys. You've already got an engagement survey because all of this information is captured. And you might argue, but isn't it better to do it online than it is face-to-face? Well, I think one of the reasons that people are cynical is that they do these things online and nothing actually happens. So why not face-to-face? Well, you might say, well, people might not be honest. Well, they may not be, but they may not be honest in any forum. There's no perfect way of capturing this information. But I think done face-to-face, you can at least qualify, question, and clarify, somebody's response, where it's very difficult to do that online. So that's the first conversation. Done and dusted, fairly simple conversation. As I said before, we move on to strengths and talents, and this is about working with what people are good at. It's essentially based on the 3P rules. The 3P rule is I practice what I prefer, and ultimately I become proficient in it. So we're actually looking at what people are good at and what they have an innate talent for. There's lots of tools out there that help people with this. Tom Rath's made I'm sure he's done very well out of StrengthsFinder 2.0. It's one of the best-selling books around from Gallup. That you can find out what your strengths are. So you can use some of the tools that you're already using for this conversation. But essentially, the employee is invited to come to that meeting with what they believe that one of their strengths is. So they're expected to come to that meeting to talk about that. Now, the manager might have a completely different idea about that, and of course he or she can share that during that conversation as well. So the strengths and talents conversation is great for succession planning. So you can build some of your succession planning around the strengths and talents conversation, because clearly if people have got, for example, leadership potential, or they're great at, they've got a very good emotional intelligence, that's going to lead them on and steer them on to other particular parts of the workplace, of different jobs. We then get to the opportunities for growth conversation. The opportunities for growth conversation is essentially looking at areas for people to work on. We've all got things we've got to work on, but normally the performance review is just about the things that aren't working. So naturally, it's not a terribly enjoyable, well, it's not a conversation, as I said, it's a monologue. Essentially, there are 4 questions that every single manager should be able to answer. And what this conversation does is it actually helps to answer those questions. Question 1, what are my expectations as a manager? Now, all managers need to be absolutely crystal clear about what they expect from people. And they've got to think very carefully, where is the crossbar? What is the minimum acceptable standard of performance that I will accept? So that's the first question. The second question is really, how are you performing to those expectations? So really, a manager, this is about feedback. And feedback, of course, is about that where people sit in terms of the expectations that managers have. So clearly that's important. The third one is, what can I do to meet those expectations? So how can the manager support his or her team members meet those? I mean the employee's still got ownership, of course. And finally, are you committed to meeting these standards in the future? So that's a very important question, because often, managers don't ask that question, do they? Are you committed to achieving this, to meeting this standard? You want to get a yes or a nod or a grunt or something from people at that point. So that's conversation 3. Conversation 4 essentially looks at learning and development. And I just challenge you here that most technical-centered approach, which is really about competency training and so forth, most of that's out there and it's well developed, and it's clearly the most popular form of learning and development, and probably the one where you get the better return on investment. Over the last 25 years, personal development has become critical, based on the premise that a person who, if you can develop them as a person, it helps them become a better employee. The one that's clearly missing is problem-centered learning. We do not use scenarios and situations and critical incidents enough in our workplace to actually develop learning, after-action reviews, debriefs, whatever you want to call them. We certainly don't do enough of that. And what the learning and development conversation provides a platform for that. The final conversation is innovation and continuous improvement, and that conversation essentially is asking the employee to come to that conversation with an idea about how they might improve or modify or instigate something in the business. Now, on the online system, there's a drop-down system then, and it gives people these particular headings. So it's not just come to the meeting with an idea. How can we improve quality, reduce time, reduce costs, increase output, increase safety, meeting deadlines, enhance interpersonal cooperation, and streamline systems and processes? So the employee ticks on one of those, writes out very, very briefly what their idea is, and then they're ready for the meeting. They can sit there with the manager and talk about that. So, in summary, before I show you the online system, there's essentially, I think, 5 benefits that go with this approach. And I think it creates an ongoing dialogue, as you could probably imagine. It's far more open and direct, so that's a nice combination. It's direct and it's open. Normally, things are closed and indirect. It's flexible. You can do these conversations on a park bench. You can do them in a car, in the lunchroom. These conversations can be done anywhere. It creates timely information for the manager to react, and also the HR manager as well, who may be the administrator in the system, will have just-in-time data to be able to maneuver and build strategic capacity. And it's obviously more relaxing because it's a conversation, not an appraisal. So I'm now going to just give you a little bit of an idea to show you how the system works, so you've got a bit of an idea as to how this may work. So what you're seeing on your screen here is this is the person that there's going to be a conversation. I'm going to do a little mock conversation between J.F. Kennedy and the other person is going to be Kermit Isaacs, and I'm just going to show you how this works. On this screen, Kennedy has actually got 3 people that report to him, and in these 3 people, when there's a little view tab there, when you click on that, you will find that it drills down. That person's actually managing somebody else, So wherever there's a view button there, because we understand that, in this case there are 3 managers that Kennedy is managing. Kennedy is going to start the process by clicking on this, which is the send initial request. So Kennedy's going to send an initial request to Kermit Isaacs. So as he does that, you'll notice that now the status has changed to preparing. So if I just go into my inbox, and very shortly we'll get an email. So if I just blow that up, you'll notice that I've got an email. So I'm Kermit. I've been asked to get involved in this process. There's a link there that Kermit can click on. So if he clicks on that link, and that will take him to his particular portal. And you'll notice there that there's a button up the top, so you can see there that this is Kermit Isaacs. Click on Start My Conversation, and you'll notice that the questions come up on the screen, so it's very easy to use. So if I say, how would I rate my job satisfaction, I'll say 6, and then I might write something in there, whatever, just for the purposes of showing you how this works. I go next. My next one, how would I rate morale in my team at the moment? Actually, I think it's pretty good. I'll give it a 9. I won't make a comment. I'll go next. How would I rate communication within the team? Well, that could be improved a lot. We'll say 4. I'll make a comment about that just for the purposes of it. I'll go next. How would I rate communication outside the team? Well, actually, I think we do a pretty good job, so I'll give it an 8. Won't make a comment. I'll go next. Is there anything else I want to comment on? No, not really. I'm happy. So I'm going to now finalize. And it just asks me whether I want to go back or finalize. I'm going to finalize. Now, I have just done my preparation for the conversation. And if I go back to my email address, or my email, and I click on Send and Receive, you'll notice that I'm now Kennedy. And Kermit has said to me that he has completed his preparation and he's ready to have a conversation. So now you can see that this is a bottom-up approach. It puts a little bit of pressure on the manager. The manager's now going to find the time, sit down for 10, 15 minutes, have the conversation, knowing full well that Kermit has gone in and done his preparation. He's going to do that. And if I go back here to Kennedy. So you'll notice now it says conversing. So the status has changed, and if I go back to the original, if I go back to Kermit's portal, I've now had my conversation, and you'll notice there's a button that appears there that was complete. So really, somebody has got to indicate somewhere in the system that the conversation's occurred, and we kind of thought the best person to do that was the employee. So we'll click on that. Yes, we've had our conversation. I'll click on that. It's all done and dusted. If I go back to my inbox, click on Send and Receive. Okay, maybe I'll go back to Kennedy. Okay, now you'll notice that the status there has changed to actioning. So if I'm now the manager, I've had the conversation with Kermit. I can now click in there, and you'll notice now it brings up a screen that shows Kermit's comments. So not only have I had a conversation with Kermit, I also can add my comments as well. So you can say whatever you want there. So there's a record. We go next. No response given. I'll just go there. Next. And next. I'm not going to make a comment. Now, the other thing that you can do here is add an action step. So I'm the manager. I'll just scroll up so you can see that. I can now say, right, this is an action. Send report, whatever. It's going to be a high priority, and I will date it for tomorrow. I'm going to save it, and I'm also going to email that to my inbox. So what happens is the manager can email that to their inbox. So, you know, they've basically got their action steps as such, as you can see down here as well. I can continue going through, whatever, and next, and finalize. And I've now completed my conversation. So if I go back, this is just helping me navigate through, but if I go back to Kennedy, you'll notice that the status says complete. So that's the cycle, that's the process. So from an HR perspective, it makes life very easy because you can drill down. For example, you have things like a status report, which will actually show all the departments. It'll show where people are at in those departments in terms of the cycle that I went through. You can even click on the actions. So you can actually get a list, and you can imagine a large organisation would have a very large list for one conversation. So the HR manager can run through those things and have a look at what some of the issues are that have come about. You've also got a remind centre, which is everybody's email address. Here, all that information is in one place. So I'll just leave it there because we're running a little short of time, but you can see how the process works, and it's there to support the 5 conversations framework as such. So I'm just about at the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to take questions. And I notice here we've got a couple. Actually, we've got a lot. So we'll see how we go with this. So one question, okay, I'll just scroll to the top. I'm not going to get through all of these. The first question is saying, how might this fit in with performance reviews? I mean, I would actually like to see it replace performance reviews, but I have had some public sector organisations look at this in terms of it being an enabler to help the performance review, be a far better, meaningful experience. So, you could probably, if it's too hard to let go of the good old performance review, you can actually use it as an enabler to have a 6th conversation, which is essentially the performance review, and hopefully it is a conversation, having gone through this process. So that's how I would go about this. There's another question here about KPIs. Where do they come into it? The KPIs, I think, are really another conversation. Normally, a manager should sit down. We did talk about expectations before, and there should be a conversation around KPIs, and there should be some agreement. And really, in the 5 conversations, you can actually raise some of those things, but essentially, I'm looking at this as a developmental opportunity, not just an appraisal. And that's a fundamentally important concept in the 5 conversations. Okay, just going to the next question. Thank you. Okay. Yes, there will be recording available as such. What's been your feedback about the 5 conversations so far is another question. We haven't, it's early days, so we haven't actually done the before and after snapshot so that I can say to you definitively it's worked in an organisation in terms of numbers. But anecdotally, we've had outstanding feedback. We've had all sorts of industries go through this. We've had, legal, accounting type professions who are getting a lot out of it. We've, as I said, public sector. We've had manufacturing, blue collar environments. In fact, they're getting a lot out of this, and I think in a lot of cases because of that informality and that ability to have those conversations anyway. So what's heartening about this is that all sorts of industries are taking this on board. But I suppose that shouldn't surprise any of us in this presentation, because people are people, and organisations are really a bunch of people working together to achieve a common objective. Essentially, that's what we're really talking about. And if we have conversations, which I believe is the lifeblood of leadership, if you're having those conversations, you're likely to nurture the people side of things and improve things as such. So I hope that sort of answered what you were getting at with that question. I can probably take one more. Okay, what's your view about ratings? Look, I don't believe in them. I think you should get rid of them. I don't understand why they're there. And essentially what happens on the Likert scale of 1 to 5, well, people are given a 3 or something because they don't want to give them a, don't want to give them a 5 because then they might drop the ball, or they don't want to give them a 2 because they feel that it might open a can of worms. Ratings aren't the critical thing. What is critical in performance conversations, in my view, is clarity, is a merging of perspectives. It's discussion, it's dialogue. To me, that's the critical part of it. Giving people ratings is, we're deluding ourselves if we think we're being objective by giving people ratings. We're not. We're basing it on observations and perceptions and so forth. And people are very cynical about that. So why not get rid of those crutches? Because it's much easier to say to someone, I'll give you a 3 out of 5, and the person walks away speculating, why did I get a 3? When really they could just simply explain to them that, yes, they're meeting expectations every now and again. For example, the other day, and explain that, but the other day this didn't happen and that was wrong and so forth. So it'd be much better to talk to people about those sorts of things rather than just give them a score, and then that's a bit of a cop-out. Now, there is another question here about how does this link in with remuneration, and that's a good question. I think this may guide and inform remuneration, but you certainly don't want to be talking about remuneration in this 5 conversations framework directly. That's absolutely wrong, and that should be another conversation that the manager has. And this may well be more data to guide and inform that decision, but this is how, that's the way to do it. So you've got a little bit more perspective on how things are going because you've had 10 conversations, short, sharp, albeit, throughout the year based on the person's development. So I think that's where you would separate the two very much. All right, well, we might leave it there. There are a couple of other questions that I didn't get to, but I realise there's so many that I'm aware that people have to get away, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity of working with you today. I hope that's given you some insight. And I started by making a couple of statements at the beginning saying that organisations are conversations. They're groups of people talking about a variety of things in a variety of contexts in various places. And what the 5 conversations framework is trying to do is to bolster and harness that capacity in an organisation, which is on the people dimension. And the other thing I'd leave you with is that this is not a hybrid performance review. This is not a old wine in new bottles concept. This is really about having a performance conversation versus a performance appraisal. And I think that's the critical point about this. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I've enjoyed working with you. You have my email address. If you want to be in contact, please do. If there are other questions you've got, happy to answer those. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for giving your time. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.